And we are back. According to the FBI's National Crime Information Center database in 2020, 40% of all women and girls reported missing were people of color, which is 100,000 out of, I should say 100,000 out of 250,000, despite making up just 16% of the population. Now, in February, Congress held a hearing to address what they call a silent epidemic of missing Black, Indigenous, and women of color. Joining us now to share more, we got the digital editor, reporter for Bronx Times, and we got Robbie Sequeira. And Robbie, thank you for being with us. These numbers are literally staggering and alarming. What can you tell us more about discussions and what's being uncovered here?
Yeah, pleasure to be on the show, first of all.
Thanks.
I think that there's, at least in the anecdotal conversations that I've had with people, as well as talking to, law enforcement, as well as talking to people who have kind of been making this an issue and kind of raising more awareness, is that when women of color go missing, there's kind of an initial issue in the process of kind of the believability. A lot of people were telling us that when if a woman of color goes missing, oftentimes their disappearance is kind of written under a voluntarily leaving, or it might put some other kind of truancy or other type of things that kind of move it from a missing case to kind of a more they voluntarily left, which really isn't the case in a lot of ways. And also we find that that isn't a pattern that's also reflected amongst when a white woman is missing. And that's to say that when anyone goes missing, they should all be found. But we're finding that these discrepancies in terms of people looking into the investigations or the disappearances of women of color is kind of grossly underinvested, or maybe grossly I would say maybe under resourced for those families when they're looking to uncover someone who's missing.
We hear the word trafficking, and that's a big word that goes on. When I've talked to people in law enforcement, there's an admission trafficking is real. However, I don't think that when we get to the real nitty gritty, that they want to let people know that it's more prevalent that we're actually getting information on. And from working behind this desk, I've had the opportunity to talk to so many people who say, listen, Daren, when it comes to trafficking, human trafficking, sex trafficking, we find predominantly women of color, indigenous people. Those are the persons that are on the front lines of trafficking. But because it's people of color and indigenous, they don't get the kind of media coverage as it would if it was someone else. Do you agree?
Yeah, I would say that for this story, I know I reached out. The kind of the focal point of my story was this indigenous woman who lives in Washington State. She was kidnapped at 6 years old and 36 years old, which is 30 years apart. And she was telling me that a lot of the women that she was trafficked with were also indigenous women. And to that degree, is a cycle of violence that happens to women of color that happens at a disproportionate rate towards white women. So looking at that first and seeing that that will also kind of translate to possibly being trafficked or possibly being in abusive situations where you are coerced into leaving or coerced into, kind of maybe packing up your life and leaving without a trace. There's an issue that a lot of people talk about where they're not looking at kind of these numbers and kind of correlating that to a disappearance or correlating it to death or correlating it to any really meaningful preventative measures to protect women of color who go missing. But also another stark issue when it comes to media coverage. We could probably off the top of my head I can list Gabby Petito and Natalie Holloway as two high-profile, high-prominent women of white women who were missing, but their cases were national profile. There's a Lifetime movie coming out about Gabby Petito, but we see this kind of a swath of women who go missing, especially indigenous women who go missing per capita, which is the highest out of any group of women. But there's very little in their coverage. There's very little in their efforts to recover them by law enforcement or even the community at large. It kind of just is, this silent epidemic is what they label it as. So there is a lot of truth to that. And I think there's a lot of ways in which people say, hey, this is an issue, that's an issue. But overall, it seems to be that when someone is a woman of color and they're going missing, there's often just a lack of attention being put to the reasons why they go disappearing, and then also the recovering of their recovery. Excuse me.
Yeah, bringing correction to this is what a lot of people are talking about. How can you get to the place where we bring correction, where it's more reporting, where it's more resources being deployed? I know Congress is acting. Bring us up to speed as to what Congress is looking to do to be able to address this issue.
Yeah, so one of the big first steps was this, congressional hearing, and you being able to hear really the tragic stories from mothers and fathers and sisters and brothers of people who've lost someone who's missing, and really talking about how there's a lot of things that can be done. Now, there's a lot of acts that have been in Congress. There's the Violence Against Women's Act, there's a Frederick Douglass Trafficking and Prevention Act, and a lot of these would be looking at kind of resourcing public safety to be able to address the incidents of when someone goes missing, and then figuring out the ways in which they have kind of maybe fallen short of recovering anyone who's missing, but also especially the disproportionate amount of women of color who are missing or end up dead. There's similar bills that are happening here in New York State. There's legislation that would create a statewide task force that would kind of urge more urgency into missing cases, but also looking into why are women of color who go missing labeled as runaways in the first place. That is obviously going to detract from enough attention from law enforcement to go look for them. And even, and crucially enough, when it comes to media coverage, a lot of media, whether it's news or paper or print or digital, they may not recover it if they feel that the reasoning for that person's disappearance is because of whether it's truancy or it's runaway. So there's a lot of things on both a federal level and a local level that is hoping to look at, hey, why is this such a silent epidemic? But also, what is that going to take? And talking to people who are kind of on the ground with this, they want to see really kind of an expansive, whether it's dispelling myths, whether it's clearing up these discrepancies and disproportionate rates. It's to just look at when someone goes missing, how can we improve the process of their recovery?
Talking to several sources that are close to this matter, I've heard that said before, listen, when you talk about this issue, it seems as though the stereotypes are there. A person's a runaway. They're not, the truancy issues. It's really not that serious. They'll come up in a day or two. And the fact is, many times, these people don't return. They're still on the missing list. Let's look at New York State's numbers for a minute. We have 606 current list of missing persons, 11 of those coming out of the borough of the Bronx, 9 being persons of color. Also, according to most recent state data, the largest single group of missing children involves black females ages 13 and up. Literally almost 30%, 29.2% of all cases reported. And, there is legislation that's being done that we want to talk about. You talked about the legislation that's being done. It was Bronx City Council person Althea Stevens who proposed the legislation about these missing girls, and then also having that label taken away of being runaway. Where do we see this going? Because we know that there's legislation out there. How quick can we see some attention to the legislation and possibly some legislation that's enacted into law?
That's a good question. I think, obviously, depending on what the makeup of Congress is going to be, in the next, couple of days or weeks as we figure out, and also the runoff, I would say that this, in terms of figuring out the issues with, this silent disparity, it seems to be a bipartisan effort. There seems to be, there's raw data that, you can't really ignore when you look at it. And there's a lot of admittance that there needs to be something done with how missing persons cases are dealt with. Also, the reliability of missing persons data isn't exactly reliable for a lot of people. There's a lot of undercounting on the women of color who go missing, related to obviously some of the implicit biases and reasons for maybe why someone, or explanations of why someone was missing in the first place. It's gonna be interesting to see how it's going to progress. I would, when I talked to John Bischoff, who works for the Missing Children Division, he said that, they really would like to see kind of things start to happen really in the next couple of months, even maybe to the next year, of just kind of getting more attention rolled out. But really, one of the big things that's going to have to happen, even if legislation's in place, is for law enforcement to take it seriously. And that means that if a family, if it's a woman of color who's going missing, it's being believed that, hey, they went missing and we need you to look for them, rather than in some cases people are saying that it's kind of pushed, as you mentioned, it's being kind of pushed aside, or they're going to come back in one day. And he said that any amount of legislation isn't going to be able to fix that. So that's something that needs to be fixed. And I think that's kind of where these task force measures come into place. It's going to be able to examine what is the breadth, what is the amount of access and resources that local departments can do to be able to recover missing persons, and also the volume of people who are missing in various states. Because in some areas where Indigenous women have gone missing, Washington State, for example, they were telling me that lack of Wi-Fi access, lack of central hubs of public safety make it a really easy area for people to be preyed upon and to be taken from their areas. So there's a lot of kind of hands-on efforts that are going to have to be taken in the next couple of years to kind of drive down a really, really disturbing rate of disappearances.
I know, Robbie, you'll be following this, and of course, we'll follow you as well. And also, we'll be staying connected on this. That way, we can really put some light on a very harrowing situation when it comes to missing people. Thank you so much for being with us.
It's a pleasure. Anytime.
All righty. Now, for more information, you can follow Robbie on Twitter at Robbie_Sequeira. Also, don't go anywhere. We will be back with more Open right after this.